Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, following last week's historic meeting between Xi, Modi, and Putin, where they pushed Trump out of the global hegemony game, it appears that the U.S. is desperately now being relegated to trying to shore up its own backyard.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a whole raft of developments we've seen in recent years, which has shown the United States to be this naked emperor with no clothes, and it doesn't just tie in with what happened during the Trump administration. We had situations where the US was unceremoniously kicked out of Afghanistan, with sort of parallels to what happened in Saigon all those years ago. The United States' influence in Africa has been diminished rapidly, not least in terms of Africa Com and stuff like that. So they clearly have been, over a period of time, losing relevance and influence. And in essence, like all failing hegemonic powers, they will sit there and go, "Well, we can go and try somewhere else." Now, obviously, we had the Ukraine war, which was an attempt to basically destroy Russia, destroy it economically, financially, get rid of Putin, put some Western puppet leader in, all these kind of idiotic things that were never going to happen. But that was because there was a determination to try and destroy Russia, and then they thought, if we can do that, we'll put China back in its box and it'll behave itself, and that will be the end of multipolarity. Of course, the Ukraine war, from the US's perspective, failed abysmally because Russia has won the war. And then conversely, of course, on the flip side to that, there was a lot of noise over quite a few years of trying to goad the Chinese into some kind of military intervention in Taiwan. And then they could have gone and said, "Oh, look, China's the aggressor, so we're going to have to put sanctions on them. We'll exclude Chinese banks from SWIFT or not, etc. And we'll do everything to try and crush China that way, and maybe and get rid of Xi, and maybe undermine the Chinese government and the whole governmental structure, and again westernize the entire country." And of course, unlike with respect to Ukraine and having the NATO members prepared to do the United States' dirty work and destroy themselves economically, financially, and geopolitically in the process, you won't get takers in Southeast Asia to do that. The only one remotely approaching any form of meaningful, in some capacity, cooperation is the Philippines, and everyone else has gone, "Forget it. We're not interested. You want to go and fight a war with China, please, please yourself." But of course, the United States is never going to war with China because of the fact that China's a nuclear power. And as we saw only the other day, China has rolled out a whole raft of new technology, including hypersonics, anti-drone technology, missiles, ICBMs, etc., etc. So, on the basis of that, the United States is looking around the world going, "Well, we need to flex our muscles somewhere, somehow, to retain any degree of relevance, because, it's not working in Southeast Asia. We're being kicked out of Africa. It's not worked out well in the Middle East either. I mean, despite everything that's gone on inside Syria, the US is really becoming persona non grata there in the process. But that's a whole complicated subject, which very sadly is pointless discussing because no one's interested in listening to it. Well, very few people, though there's a huge story there to be told, but it is what it is. So, in essence, where's the United States got left to go? Well, only its own backyard, which is, of course, set principally Central and South America. And I'll give way to you, Ken, and then we'll get into the nuts and bolts of that. But that's in essence a kind of 30,000 foot view of the fact that the United States isn't able to flex its muscles anywhere in the world, so it'll just go in its own backyard and want to project some faux power there in the process as well.
Yeah, early on in America's history, of course, we had the Monroe Doctrine, which was not necessarily focused on South and Central American nations being in opposition to the United States. It was more of an old colonial thing, saying that the United States would protect the Western Hemisphere from colonial power Europe and other things, maybe even the Barbary pirates, if you want to throw in Morocco and North Africa. But when you take a look at that mindset from the founding of this country, there's always been this belief that we're the hegemonic powers in the Western Hemisphere, no matter what. And look at what Trump did when he first came into office. He goes after Greenland, which is under the sovereignty of Denmark. He goes after the Panama Canal, which was given in its own right to the sovereignty of Panama, who made its own decisions to sell the management to Chinese corporations. Well, those things have fallen by the wayside. So now Trump is going after, it appears, both Canada in regards to fentanyl, Mexico, and of course now Venezuela. So he's trying to instill his power, showing the stick, as Teddy Roosevelt used to, imply. But the reality is that we have such little fear. You know, uh, Look what happened. Trump is not afraid to go out and just bomb anybody willy-nilly like he did in Iran. But he also has this fear that's holding him back from going too far because he knows that the United States is not prepared for the repercussions of taking something to a finality when it comes to real countries, not Afghanistan or Iraq.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's worth, and we talked about Venezuela not that long ago, and I'm not going to rehash everything that was discussed there, but there's people now going, well, there's more to this whole story of Vietnam, and there was this, sorry, to Venezuela, and there's this whole issue of this ship that was sunk with, I think it was a crew of 11 people on board, and they were saying it was related to narcotics, etc. And then the US is kind of stationing ships all around that region. Now, the argument is, and we've said this before, the US is in no position, no matter what anyone says, including Hegseth, that we're going to have regime change in Venezuela. On what basis? It's absolutely impossible, whilst the Venezuelan military, which it does, supports Maduro 100%. They've got nothing that could remotely instigate regime change there. I mean, the only thing they can possibly think they can do is scare the Venezuelan people enough into revolting and trying to get rid of him, but that's not going to work either. So, yes, they're clearly up to something, and the argument is, well, it seems a bit tenuous to go after all the narco trade because they have their armies in of themselves, and declaring war on them is probably a very dangerous thing for any administration to do for very obvious reasons. But we can't entirely rule it out. So this is kind of fueling some of the idea that the United States is going, well, it's over for us meddling in Southeast Asia. The same, obviously, in terms of what's happened in with regards to Ukraine and Russia. That's a complete failure, and there's no way we're going to come out of that smelling a rose. Is the only way we come out of that with our credibility intact is just to try and walk away and pretend we were never there and pretend we weren't an aggressor, which of course they were. So the whole Greenland story's kind of largely died a death. The whole Ukraine thing will die a death because there's no way that minerals deal will ever see the light of day. But the US is after resources. We've said this before, and that's very clear. Well, they're not going to get any resources out of Russia, that's for sure, unless the Russians want to sell them, energy, for example. So the logical conclusion is the United States, and as Ken's pointed out, obviously there is already rumblings and has been with regards to Canada. Forget the issue of Trump basically saying it's the 51st state. This was just high octane rhetoric. But the US has been kind of making veiled threats against Mexico on and off for a while. So there is clearly seems to be evidence that the US were now walking away from the Far East, although there are some contradictory statements with regards to that. So we have to be a little bit careful in our interpretation, but that seems to be more likely to be the position. So is it a coincidence that the US has started trying to flex its muscles for some reason in parts of the Caribbean, in off the coast of Venezuela, etc.? And the logic is, do all these countries have? Like Venezuela, enormous energy reserves, and if you look collectively, the whole of the Americas is also in possession, to varying degrees in each country, though, of large resource capabilities. So this is the US trying to flex its muscles and realizing, well, Europe's gone, Europe's dead in the water, it's financially broke. I mean, in the end of the day, it's a waste of time and a spent force a long time ago. So, and they haven't got any resources, basically. There's nothing that really benefits the United States to be there anymore. And because they're looking at what's going on with the multipolar world and going, well, this just increasingly looks like we're becoming more and more irrelevant in Europe, in Eurasia for that matter. So now we need to start turning attention to somewhere else. Well, let's go home and basically in our backyard, let's see what we can derive from meddling in that region. And that seems to be now more and more clearly the case. And there is rumors or mutterings to the effect the US is turning its attention to more domestic matters, or so basically the Americas, including of course Central America and South America. But of course, again, there's the small matter of China has huge influence across the Americas. Russia has some influence there now because Russia and China are everywhere. So it's not going to be straightforward for the US to decide to throw its weight around there and try and reignite its hegemony, albeit in its back door in a relatively small part of the world, which frankly I don't think those countries are going to tolerate it anyway.
Yeah, many times we like to, of course, diss on President Trump for especially his foreign policy decisions. They are, in our opinions, absolutely atrocious and detrimental to world peace. But on the flip side, there are many things in America, in his true backyard, that he's trying to do after decades and decades and decades of deterioration from within. That if he focused primarily on that, then I think he would be accomplish a whole hell of a lot more, as well as have a much better reputation. But unfortunately, you know, he's becoming a dime store Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, of course, is taking on, Trump is taking on a period after the Biden administration where we saw Afghan be Saigon 2.0, the United States just, in reputation, absolute in decline. So he's trying to rebuild the image, Morning in America type of thing that Reagan did. And Reagan used strategic or tactical and strategic attacks to try to show America's reburgeoning strength, i.e., Libya, but at the same time tried to act like a diplomat, working with Thatcher and Gorbachev to eventually lead to the end of the Cold War. But where Trump is saying, I will bring peace to Ukraine. I will bring peace here and there. Uh, when he tries to do it, he quickly contradicts himself to get involved in every single conflict on the planet, or any type of thing that's going negative. So with that being said, he's got so many things on his plate that he's trying to be the master of, that in reality, anything he does that is beneficial is quickly overwhelmed by all the failures that he's doing internationally.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think fundamentally this comes back to the fact the US is being pushed more and more to the periphery. It's not an hegemonic power anymore. No one believes that except some of the most staunch uh, Americans inside the Beltway and the US population. But that's irrelevant what they think, it's what the reality is. And they're now just getting so desperate they want to try and flex their muscles on their doorstep, but there's going to be huge resistance in doing that. And if the US seriously thinks it's going to implement regime change in Venezuela that easily, then you'd have to be assuming, as I said before, that the military is turned on Maduro, and there's zero evidence of that. That could change, of course, but at the moment that's extremely unlikely. And Venezuela can manage with the help of like the likes of Chinese and Russians. So they're in a position to weather the storm if the US tries to, well, if the US tries to have a complete blockade of Venezuela, that might be a different matter. But that, hence why, of course, they're trying to suggest that Maduro is somehow linked to the narco trade. I mean, but again, they can make these statements, but who actually is believing it apart from a bunch of Americans and the rest of the world? The Europeans don't care, and the rest of the world's going, look, we know what your game is. We know what you're trying to do. But the US is desperate for resources, is desperate to try and regain some of its old hegemonic power, which is completely lost. And so we can expect to see them meddling or claiming to meddle or just generally being a nuisance in the whole of the Americas. But the chance of them scoring some major success is unlikely. And at the end of the day, who's going to fight with them? Who's going to instigate proxy wars on their behalf in, South America? The Europeans? No. Who? Other South American countries? No. So the United States has always benefited from the fact that it had NATO in its back pocket, and NATO countries would always do what they were told ultimately, because that's how the whole or the existence of the Eurozone is predicated on. So they're basically subservient to the US, but the US doesn't have that kind of alliance or subservient countries who are going to just do what the US tells them to do. So, I mean, and particularly go to war with another country? It's far different to what Ukraine is all about, or anywhere else that the United States has had military forays in recent decades. So it's going to be incredibly difficult for them, other than going into countries themselves, which is going to be total suicide as far as any president's concerned in doing that, because the US will just be kicked out and unceremoniously. And there's no way that a US president's going to survive that. So really, it's very, very strange what the US thinks they're going to achieve in doing this. But they're in a situation where they're desperate. They're desperate to retain, or they're desperate for the world to believe in them once again, and the world doesn't. I mean, and therefore, on that basis, this is all rather futile, but there could be potential for them to cause quite a bit of damage in the process of trying to feel as though now's the time for us to try and consume the rest of the Americas, to be, part of the United States in some capacity. I'm not saying they're going to be absorbed into the US, but rather like, well, we need to assert ourselves and get them back on track because also will cause the Russians and the Chinese a bit of grief in the process. So we're very happy about that, but also we're happy about the fact that we've managed to, or they think they can somehow get more and more nations on side to be a buffer, as it were, or some a countenance to the rapid rise of multipolarity. And what happened in China with Modi, Xi, and Putin is just something in the United States. It fried their brains and they went into panic mode, which is why they're now trying to get Modi back on side and go, oh, and just ignore all those comments that were previously made. Remember, we're here to support each other and work together, and you're a great ally. I mean, so why come out with the comments they did previously? But again, that's because the United States is desperate and realizes that it's losing allies hand over fist as the world moves away from unipolarity to multipolarity.
Yeah, one final thing I want to add is the United States has one single thing left of its hegemonic power still, even though it's rapidly declining, and that's still the global reserve currency. But economic numbers that came out this week, uh, obviously, Bissett lauded another $31 billion in tariffs that we're going to get for the budget for this month. But what wasn't spoken was that $550 billion of debt was added to the national debt. So they're hemorrhaging debt far more quickly, while at the same time using extortion to try to hold on to their old vassals. And what's ending up happening is they're driving everybody away. Obviously, Modi is the most significant one. There was a quote from Trump: "Looks like we've lost India and Russia to deepest, darkest China." That's really capitulation. That statement right there is capitulation. And so, with that being said, the U.S. needs the world buying our debt. They need the world still using our dollars. And once that is gone, there's not a single thing the United States has that the world wants. And if we've got the reputation that is has been created over the past several or couple of decades, then when that goes, pardon me there, when that goes, then everything is lost. And so, the United States isn't even going to have the power or the financial power or the military power to be able to sustain the Western Hemisphere, which has been sort of like a guarantee ever since really the rise of the country 250 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I think that's a good point to stop today.
Okay, Paul, as always, thank you for being a part of this discussion and for your insight.
Yes, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, as always, thank you for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.